Douglas Trevor is the author of the short story collection, The Thin Tear in the Fabric of Space, which won the 2005 Iowa Short Fiction Award and was a finalist for the 2006 Hemingway Foundation Penn Award for First Fiction. He's a graduate of Princeton and Harvard and an associate professor of Renaissance literature and creative writing at the University of Michigan. Please welcome Douglas Trevor.
Say anything about yourself? It was so modest introduction. Thank you, Michelle, my editor, who did not identify herself as such. And thank you all for coming. I want to especially thank Michelle for being here, and Ashley, who's joining the MFA program at Michigan. And I'm going to say a few things about Girls I Know, the novel, and then I'm just going to read 7 pages from the second chapter. If you're going to follow along, are you going to follow along, Ashley? Yeah. It's I'll pick it up at the bottom of 23. But in terms of what the book is about, this is a novel that I started to think about a long time ago when I was in graduate school in Boston. I thought that I was working on a series of short stories at the time, and most of them were set in places I had lived in prior to moving to Boston. And I wanted to write about Boston, and I was particularly struck when I walked around the city, which I did a lot since I didn't own a car because I was a graduate student. I was always struck by how distinct the neighborhoods were. And I started to think I was trying to think of an idea for a novel, having never written one before. And I was intrigued by that idea of having different characters from different parts of these distinct neighborhoods come together and get to know each other. So I started to think about the novel largely in these kind of spatial terms before I started to think even about characters or about plot. And then I started to think about 3 characters in particular around whom the novel ends up orbiting. The novel set in the winter of 2001. I was trying to do a sort of pre-9/11 novel, and it's kind of a funny experience now because I realize there are things you can do if you set a novel in 2001 that you can't do anymore. For instance, the central character, Walt Stedman, doesn't own a cell phone, which I think is pretty much impossible now, but in 2001 was possible. There's a pivotal moment late in the book where he reaches out to his friend Ginger Newton by using a payphone to call her, and I don't think the payphone he uses, which is in the middle of Harvard Square, exists anymore. But anyway, the novel follows the lives of Walt and Ginger and a young girl, Mercedes, about whom I'll say something in just a second, in the winter of 2001. And I was interested in looking at these 3 characters in the context of something traumatic that happens to 2 of them, and indirectly to a third as a result. So there's a popular restaurant where Walt, the central character, has breakfast every morning called the Early Bird Cafe, based on a real cafe in Jamaica Plain. And there's a restaurant shooting that occurs in the Early Bird Cafe, and the novel is largely about thinking about the after effects and the consequences of the restaurant shooting on Walt and the other characters, and also thinking more broadly about what it means to experience violence in America or elsewhere in the early 2000s, and how violence reshapes people's lives and can spawn an opportunity for people to rethink who they are, and also give people an opportunity to create friendships and connections that they wouldn't otherwise pursue. So the novel grew once I'd had a challenge, as I think a lot of short story writers do, in writing stories in which a lot of things happen. And I was really interested in the novel about having or creating a central event from which there were direct consequences that developed. And so the restaurant shooting for me was really interesting. I started doing research on restaurant shootings, which was kind of grisly, but also interesting. I read a lot, but the most insightful thing I learned was in a casual conversation with a police officer on a Boston street corner once, where I asked him about restaurant shootings, told him I was writing a book, and he commented that in his experience, although he hadn't been involved in too many, but in his experience, no one ever runs in a restaurant shooting. Everyone just sort of stays seated. So I thought that was something that was really haunting, and that stuck with me. I'm actually not going to read from the shooting scene, but so I researched a variety of different restaurant shootings, some in Boston, some outside of Boston. And I was thinking more broadly about the idea of novels that orbit around this question of the existence of evil. The Clockwork Orange is one that I think of, and what it means to think about novelistic experiences in a novel as centered around a confrontation with evil in some way. So that becomes a part of this novel, because as you'll learn when I start to read from it. The title of the novel, Girls I Know, is also replicated in the book because the character that we meet in the opening pages of the book, Ginger Newton, is a kind of precocious 20-something, fairly entitled and privileged Harvard undergraduate, decides that she wants to write a book called Girls I Know that will look at the working experiences of women, young women in and around Boston, as a way of meditating on what it means to try to get by in life, to try to improve one's own circumstances in life, and also to deal with experiences of trauma. So the central character of the book is this guy, Walt Stedman, who's 29 years old, and prior to the beginning of the book, he's moved from Burlington, Vermont, down to Boston in order to study American poetry, 20th century American poetry, at Harvard. He starts a PhD program, he ends up dropping out, and then he supports himself in a variety of ways. He lives and works as the superintendent of a kind of posh apartment building in a really nice part of Boston called the Back Bay. And then he also works behind the counter at a dry cleaners and sells his sperm at a sperm bank in Brighton, township sort of outside of Boston. There are a couple of sperm bank scenes that I also will not read tonight. And then, so at the beginning of the book, I think the narrative arc of the book that's the most prominent is that at the beginning, Walt isn't really sure what to do with himself. And then by the time he gets to the end of the novel, he's sort of figured out at least one path that he could take. I won't tell you what that is in the hopes that maybe you'll read the book. But one of the central experience really, that there are two experiences that change Walt's life in the course of Girls I Know. One is his encounter and the friendship he develops with Ginger. And the other is that he gets to know the young girl whose name is Mercedes Biddles, an 11-year-old girl whose parents owned the Early Bird Cafe and who die in the restaurant shooting. What ends up happening in the course of the novel is Walt ends up tutoring Mercedes and trying to help her with her homework, and in ways I hadn't anticipated when I sketched out the novel before I started to write it, at least the second half. The actual perspective of the novel shifts to Mercedes' perspective during much of the second half. So what I thought I'd read a little bit from tonight is a scene from the second chapter of Girls I Know, which picks up at the end of a fairly typical day in the life of Walt Stedman. So I'll read a few pages, and thank you for coming tonight. Since he always had a good breakfast and was on a tight budget, Walt never ate lunch, and because he never ate lunch, he was always starving in the early evening. There was a small deli across from his building, and Walt usually swung by and bought a burrito and a Coke before going inside to the basement studio. But that night his routine was disrupted by the sight of a girl in the half-light, hunched over the doorknob of his building. He knew the silhouettes of all of his tenants, and this girl wasn't a tenant. If she had been, he would have waited in the shadows until she'd entered the building. Instead, he crossed the street and made his way toward her. She was wearing a black wool skirt and black leggings with big, clunky black boots on her feet. Walt noticed the boots when the girl stepped back and gave the doorknob a swift kick. The next thing he noticed was her parka, which was silver-colored, puffy, and stylish. She was a good-looking girl wearing an expensive outfit and acting miffed. In the Back Bay, she seemed to fit right in. "Can I help you?" he called up to her. She stepped back onto the top of the building's entrance and turned toward him. "This lock is a piece of shit," she said. "Yeah, you can't put the key all the way in. If you do, it won't catch." Walt skipped up the steps and slipped around her, withdrawing the key ever so slightly from the lock. Then he turned it with ease. "See?" "Cool. Thanks. One of my movers figured it out this morning, but he didn't tell me the trick. The super was supposed to meet us here, but he didn't show." Walt straightened his posture. Well, this was unfortunate. He'd assumed she was staying with someone, not that she was a new tenant. New tenants he avoided as much as possible, since they always had tons of questions and entirely too many logistical needs. Also, he preferred for new arrivals to discover over time that he wasn't the most responsible superintendent, by which point he hoped that his reputation as a nice, affable guy would make his flakiness more forgivable. "That's my bad," he said. "I'm the super." She held herself awkwardly, her head over her neck, her torso pivoted on her hips, while she frowned at him. "Walt Stedman? Stedman. Yeah, Walt Stedman. I'm so sorry." She unwrapped a Tootsie Pop from her parka and put it in her mouth. "Didn't you get the message I left on your machine?" "The thing about my answering machine is, he ruffled his hair as he leaned back against the side of the building in an attempt to appear a little more boyish and a little less like a superintendent. The erase button is really close to the play button, and sometimes, you could hit the one instead of the other. She smirked at him. Maybe you should think about making the jump to voicemail. She held out her hand. Ginger Newton. Walt tucked his book under his arm while they shook hands. The name meant nothing to him, at least not the first name. The last name made him think a little because of the township. Newton? She nodded. Walt cleared his throat. Whose place did you buy? By you, he meant her parents, of course. By you, he named her as rich and young, probably younger than all the other occupants in the building, but not that much younger than some of them. No one's, she said. I'm staying in Blair Montgomery's apartment for the semester. That's what my message explained. Oh, okay, he said, nodding. He liked how she said semester, as if the academic calendar applied to everyone. She had the whole thing down, the combination of presumptuousness and lurking displeasure, the great outfit, the tortured posture. And she was really attractive, he could see now, with the streetlight right above them, if in a more than slightly cliched way. Her complexion was very light, her nose straight, with perfectly symmetrical, thin nostrils, and her eyes were a deep blue. She also had a mass of tangled blonde hair piled on her head and set in place by an intricate system of barrettes and pins, and a pointed chin toward which her entire face was drawn. Blair sent me his key and said I could just show up. I didn't think I'd have a problem with the lock or getting a hold of you. Ginger sucked her Tootsie Pop. How'd you swing in the place? Walt asked. Are you and Blair related? She laughed. Her laugh was louder than he expected. It startled him. Am I related to Blair Montgomery? That's hilarious. No, he's sort of a family friend. Actually, I barely know him. He's like twice my age. Walt winced. I decided I needed to get out of my dorm, do something a little different. I have this idea for a project. She stopped herself and pointed out at the street toward a black Lexus parked in front of a fire hydrant. Is there anywhere I can park my car? Yeah, you have a spot in back, Walt said. Cool. She bit down on the remaining candy, removed the cardboard stick from her mouth, and threw it in the bank of snow next to the stone staircase on which she stood. In the spring, Walt thought, once the snow has thawed, I'll have to pick that up. They both walked inside. Do you go to Harvard, he asked her, as they made their way into the hallway. I mean, that's where Blair went. Not that you would necessarily. No, she jumped in, that's where I go. But I didn't go to St. Paul's or wherever Blair attended boarding school. My family isn't into all that. I went to Trinity in New York. I'm a New Yorker. Walt hit the button for the elevator. Apparently he was showing her up to her new place, half a day late, but still. So what are you, a sophomore? Junior? Junior. I'm in Elliott House. Was in Elliott House, but my quad kind of fell apart. The doors opened and they stepped inside. Ginger hit the button for the third floor. One girl's taking a leave of absence because she's having a nervous breakdown. Then the other two, they're my friends, but only in the college sense. They told our RA about Sid. He knew, but they complained. Sid was a pretense. They were really complaining about me, see? I'm hard to live with. I get that. So rather than send Sid home to my parents, who were too afraid of him to feed him, I decided to look for my own place. Then I heard about Blair going out of town and everything came together, blah, blah, blah. And like I said, more importantly, I have this idea I want to develop. Walt interrupted her. Who's Sid? Oh, my pet boa constrictor. The door opened. The building had a no pets rule, but Walt had a strong feeling he wouldn't have the temerity to bring it up to Ginger Newton. They walked down the hallway of the third floor to the farthest door on the left, which Ginger opened without any problem. Come on in, she said. Walt hesitated. She probably already had a list of complaints about the unit that she'd expect him to attend to right away, but she had walked in, so we followed her. Blair's apartment was a one-bedroom that overlooked Beacon Street. Even by the high standards of the building, the apartment was a nice one, with hardwood floors, granite countertops in the kitchen, and a brick fireplace in the living room, in front of which a bare mattress had been placed, bordered on one side by two enormous duffel bags, their unzipped tops disgorging clothes like miniature volcanoes. Blair has a waterbed, Ginger explained, nodding at the mattress. I hate waterbeds. I didn't want to sleep in his room anyway. That'd be kind of weird. But sleeping on a mattress on the floor a few yards from a boa constrictor was perfectly normal. Walt wandered over to the far corner of the room where Ginger had set up Sid's large tank, along with heat lamps above and what looked to be an electric blanket below. He placed his nose against the glass. Sid uncoiled quickly, his tongue flickering out. Walt stepped back. He put his length right at 3 feet. "Are you afraid of snakes?" she asked. "I think I might be, yes." Ginger laughed again. What kind of laugh was it? A nervous or a brash one? He wasn't sure. "Don't be. Sid's awesome unless you're a rat," she said. Walt thought of this thing getting out of its tank and ending up in another tenant's place. Who the hell would he call then to solve that disaster? He surveyed the room some more from his new vantage point in the corner. In addition to the duffel bags, a leather trunk had been dumped just in front of the counter that divided the kitchen area from the living room. Its lid left open, Walt glimpsed dozens of books piled within it. He wandered over to examine their titles. The Scholastic Theology Reader, Aristotle in Outline, the Letters of Abelard and Eloise, the Sentences of Peter Lombard. Everything else he saw was either written by Thomas Aquinas or had his name in the title. He picked up one of the thicker tomes entitled The Shorter Summa. "Couldn't they make it any shorter than this?" he joked. Ginger plucked the book out of his hand. "Don't get them out of order," she said. "There's a system in play here." Walt stepped back, both from the tank and from Ginger. What the hell was going on here? Was she flirting with him a little? Girls in the Back Bay flirted with Walt a fair amount, but usually before discovering that he was a superintendent, not so much after. "I should let you unpack," he said. "Why would I unpack? It's so boring." She crossed her arms. Her left foot was stuck out in front of her and pointed to the side, probably a vestige of childhood ballet lessons or something. She was an awkward thing. Then again, most girls her age, with her particular look and grooming, were awkward things. In fact, they seemed to cultivate their awkwardness. She gestured toward her pile of books. "I'm a philosophy major. I'm all about the scholastics." She caught herself. They were philosophers. I know who the scholastics were. Walt shot back, although he was a little fuzzy on several details, such as when exactly they lived and what exactly they thought. "So you're getting a head start on your reading for next semester?" "In part. Well, I'm reading this one." Ginger picked up a thick book with a white spine. "For this course on the problem of evil in the medieval period I'm about to take. But I was going to read it anyway, this break. The course is just an excuse." Walt glanced at the cover, Thomas Aquinas' De Malo. "Have you read it?" He shook his head. "Oh, it's awesome. It's a theodicy. You know, a defense of God as omnipotent, omnipresent, and perfectly good in spite of the existence of evil. The De Malo is behind this little project I have in mind. In English, the title means on evil, but isn't the Latin so much better?" "Oh, so much." She set the book down. "Don't make fun of Aquinas. He's my favorite philosopher. I'm getting ready to start my project first thing tomorrow morning, so I'm going to be inhabiting his worldview here for a little bit. That's how I like to work. You know, I don't just want to study an idea, I want to live it." "What's your..." Walt hesitated to ask. Harvard undergraduates all had their little projects. He remembered this from the 2 semesters he had spent as a teaching assistant there. Whenever he had handed out their paper assignments, immediately after class, everyone would email him and ask for an extension due to extenuating circumstances. "I'm presenting a paper at the World Bank that week," one of them would explain. "I've begun my own foundation and we're having our first fundraiser." That one was fairly common. "I'm traveling to Central Africa to build latrines. I have to help a gubernatorial candidate in California I interned for last summer with a speech. I'm beginning research on my senior honors thesis with a trip to northern Mongolia." "Oh, it's silly," Ginger said, shaking her head. "Okay, I'm embarrassed to admit this." He gave her a few seconds. She twisted several times at her waist. "This is going to sound weird." She paused, composing herself. Walt didn't think her self-consciousness was fully felt. He was willing to buy that she was a little uncomfortable, but he suspected that just a few hours into living off campus, she was already terrified of being deprived of a captive audience. "All right," she began. So my generation, you know, we're all a really clever generation. We like irony. We like to look through things, get to the heart of stuff. We are witty. We're good at banter. And we're super self-involved. Even if you factor in that each generation of Americans, since the end of World War II, has been more self-involved than the preceding generation, we are really self-involved. Every girl with an eating disorder from my high school is writing a novel about a girl with an eating disorder from my high school. The fact that I don't really like anyone my age, or at least anyone I've met who's my age, that I would try to write about something bigger than myself. Although write about isn't quite right. She bit at her lower lip. Actually, now Ginger did look genuinely ill at ease. So I have this idea. I'll interview women from all walks of life to see what they do to get by, what motivates them, what they care about. I want to hear how they face the evils of the world. It'll be a theodicy in the form of personal narratives, something Aquinas might have written if he had been a women's studies major. The working title is Girls I Know. Walt looked at her blankly. Actually, he hadn't followed her. She wanted to imitate Thomas Aquinas by conducting personal interviews, and she didn't like people her age. But she seemed, in a sense, the perfect embodiment of someone her age, at least someone at Harvard. She had money, she was pretty, she was smart. He didn't know what to say, and she was waiting for him to respond. So it's going to be a book about Boston. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, Ginger said. Well, this is your lucky day. I'm an expert on Boston. Are you? And she smiled at him, the dimples hollowing out both her cheeks. Yes, I am, he said, all things Boston. And he thought, what the hell? She had appeared out of nowhere, after all. What did he have to lose? Do you want a tour? Right now? Not by car. We'll go up to the roof. I'll point out some buildings. We'll freeze our asses off. Walt stood there waiting while she mulled over his offer. You know something, Ginger shrugged? This is my first night in Boston proper. Why not? So I'm going to stop there. That's just the opening of the Walt-Ginger relationship and a slight explanation of Ginger's book project, which will consume her during the course of Girls I Know. So thank you for coming out. I don't think do I need to take questions? I don't think I have questions.
Yes,
Any questions?
Here. We'll have a conversation.
Thank you.